Life has a cruel way of exposing our vulnerabilities when we least expect it. For Maxwell Rothschild, that revelation came as the acrid smell of something burning filled the cabin of his Bentley Continental GT, and thick, dark smoke billowed from the hood of his $500,000 vehicle. Fate had chosen the worst possible moment. It was 9:47 on a frigid Tuesday morning in winter, and in exactly 20 minutes he was supposed to be presiding over a meeting that could determine the future of Goldcrest Enterprises. $50 million. That was the value of the deal slipping through his fingers as he stood helplessly, watching his luxury car die a slow death in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. The contrast was almost poetic. His $12,000 Italian suit against the peeling paint of the surrounding buildings, his handcrafted shoes stepping on the uneven asphalt of a street that would never appear in the meticulously curated narrative of his life. Damn GPS, he cursed, slamming the steering wheel in frustration. The technology that had never failed him had picked today, of all days, to suggest a shortcut through this forgotten neighborhood, an area Maxwell usually glimpsed only through the tinted windows of his car while en route to a private airport. At 42 years old, Maxwell Rothschild was the embodiment of American corporate success. CEO of Goldcrest Enterprises since the age of 35, he had transformed a declining family business into a billion-dollar empire. His face graced the covers of business magazines, and his name was whispered with reverence in the halls of Wall Street. Yet now, stranded on this narrow, nearly deserted street, all his influence and power seemed utterly meaningless. The phone in his pocket, a cutting-edge device that usually connected him to the world's financial nerve centers, displayed just one feeble, useless bar of signal. It wasn't even enough to call his exclusive roadside assistance service. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few residents hurrying to work in worn uniforms, casting curious glances his way, some tinged with pity, others with suspicion. Maxwell felt a bead of sweat slide down his temple despite the biting cold outside. It wasn't fear, he told himself. Maxwell Rothschild didn't feel fear. It was discomfort. A deep, unsettling sense of not belonging that left him exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt since his childhood, long before he built his fortress of success and arrogance. That was when his eyes landed on a small corner store. The establishment looked like a relic of a bygone era, a neighborhood shop reminiscent of his grandfather's time, with a faded sign and paint that had been crying out for a fresh coat for years. The sign read Corner Market in plain, unassuming letters. Under normal circumstances, Maxwell wouldn't have even considered stepping into a place like that. But normal circumstances had been left behind along with the smoke from his Bentley. Adjusting his silk tie and assuming his usual commanding posture, the one he used to intimidate boardrooms and close multimillion-dollar deals, Maxwell crossed the street. The soft chime of the doorbell rang as he entered, an unexpectedly comforting sound that caught him off guard. The inside of the store was a surprise. Despite its simplicity, there was a meticulous order to the arrangement of products. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the scent of warm bread, creating an atmosphere that stirred long-buried memories of his childhood. Visiting Mr. Jenkins' grocery store with his mother before success had turned him into the man he was today. Behind the counter, a young woman was organizing shelves, her hands moving with the precision of someone who knew every inch of the space. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple bun, and she wore a clean but well-worn apron. "Good morning," she said without turning around, her voice surprisingly melodic and clear. "I'll be with you in a moment." "Actually, I need to use your phone," Maxwell replied, his usual authoritative tone slightly softened by necessity. "My car broke down and—" The woman turned and Maxwell's words died in his throat. Grace Johnson, as he would later learn, was not the type of beauty that graced magazine covers or frequented the gala events he was accustomed to. Yet there was something in her brown eyes, a unique blend of strength and kindness, that made him momentarily forget his automotive disaster and the multimillion-dollar meeting he was about to miss. "The landline's been out since yesterday," she said, brushing her hands against her apron in an unconscious attempt to smooth it. "And judging by your suit, I'm guessing you need more than just a quick phone call." There was something in her voice, a blend of pragmatism and genuine compassion, that challenged the cynicism Maxwell had cultivated over years of corporate battles. Before he could formulate a response, the sound of shattering glass echoed from the back of the store, followed by the frightened cry of a child. Grace immediately rushed toward the sound, leaving Maxwell alone in the main part of the grocery store. He could have walked out, found help elsewhere. That was what his instinct for self-preservation screamed for him to do. But something, perhaps an inexplicable curiosity or maybe an impulse buried under decades of ambition, urged him to follow the noise. What he found in the back of the store would stay with him forever. Grace cradled a girl of about 6 years old, who was sobbing as shards of a broken jar of jam glinted on the floor. But it wasn't the accident itself that caught his attention. It was what lay beyond, a small, makeshift area with a neatly made bed, a few toys stored in cardboard boxes adorned with childlike drawings, and schoolbooks stacked on an improvised table. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They lived here in the back of the grocery store. This modest space was their home, their refuge, their entire world. "Emily, how many times have we talked about not trying to reach things on your own?" Grace whispered to the child, checking her hands for cuts. Her voice, though concerned, was laced with endless patience. "You could have hurt yourself badly." "I'm sorry, Mommy," the little girl whimpered, her large blue eyes brimming with tears. "I just wanted to surprise you with breakfast." "You worked so late last night?" Maxwell stood silently watching the exchange, a peculiar sensation swelling in his chest. In a life devoted to amassing wealth and power, he had presided over billion-dollar mergers, crushed competitors, and built an empire. But something about this simple, honest moment touched him in a way no high-stakes negotiation ever had. The moment was brutally interrupted by the shrill wail of a siren outside. Maxwell glanced at his watch again, 10:05. The meeting with the Japanese investors had already begun without him. On any other day this would have been an unthinkable disaster. Yet, for the first time in his career, the millions at stake felt strangely insignificant in light of the scene he had just witnessed. "Sir?" Grace's voice brought him back to reality. She had seated Emily in a chair and now faced him with a mixture of embarrassment and dignity that caught him off guard. "Sorry for the trouble. About your phone?" "Maxwell," he introduced himself, surprising even himself with the informality. "Maxwell Rothschild. And don't worry about the phone. In fact," he hesitated, an idea beginning to take shape in his mind. An idea that, though he didn't yet realize it, would change the course of many lives. "Maybe we can help each other." At that moment, standing in the back of a rundown grocery store, with the smell of spilled jam in the air and the distant sound of his career collapsing, Maxwell Rothschild was about to discover that sometimes we have to lose everything we think is important to find what truly matters. Fate, through a broken Bentley and a spilled jar of jam, had orchestrated a meeting that would defy all odds and transform not just 2 lives, but an entire community. The story about to unfold would prove that the greatest changes often begin in the most unlikely places, and that true success isn't always measured in dollars and cents. Maxwell Rothschild was not a man accustomed to improvisation. Every step of his life followed a meticulously crafted plan, every decision weighed against spreadsheets and risk analyses. But now, as he helped Grace Johnson clean up the shards of glass from the broken jam jar, his hands encased in bright yellow rubber gloves that looked absurdly out of place with his designer suit, he found himself wondering just what he was doing. "You really don't have to help," Grace said for the 3rd time, her embarrassment evident in the way she avoided looking directly at him. "I'm sure you have important commitments." "I did," Maxwell replied, surprising himself with the honesty in his own voice. "But some things are more important than meetings." Emily, now calmer after her initial fright, watched the scene with childlike curiosity from her safe perch in the small makeshift kitchen. Her blue eyes darted between her mother and the well-dressed stranger now kneeling on the floor of her home, as if she were trying to solve a particularly puzzling riddle. "You look like the prince from the movie," she declared suddenly, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the room. Grace flushed deeply. "Emily, don't be." "Which prince?" Maxwell asked, a genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time that morning. "The one who got lost in the forest and found Snow White's house," the girl answered with the absolute certainty only children possess. "Except you found our store." The innocent comment hit Maxwell like a lightning bolt of clarity. In a way he really was lost, not in a forest but in the maze of his own empty existence, filled with numbers, contracts, and an unrelenting quest for more power. And now, by some twist of fate, he had stumbled upon, what, exactly? "Grace," he said, rising to his feet and peeling off the rubber gloves, "I need to make a proposal." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a shadow of suspicion crossing her face. Maxwell realized she had probably heard many proposals in her life, and few of them had likely been genuinely in her favor. "I'm the CEO of Goldcrest Enterprises," Maxwell continued, keeping his voice calm and professional. "We're expanding our network of neighborhood markets, focusing on establishments with real growth potential." "Mr. Rothschild," Grace interrupted, her voice firm despite the tension evident in her posture, "I appreciate the interest, but this store isn't for sale. It's all I have to leave for my daughter." Maxwell shook his head, a gesture he had perfected in countless negotiations. "I don't want to buy your store, Grace. I want to transform it." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room. Despite its evident organization and cleanliness, the space desperately needed improvement. The shelves were worn, the refrigeration system hummed ominously, and the ceiling showed clear signs of water damage. "What I'm proposing is a partnership. Goldcrest would provide the capital to completely modernize this space, upgrade the stock, expand the inventory, and implement modern management systems. You would retain full control of the operation but with the resources to turn this into something much bigger." Grace remained silent for a long moment, her eyes studying Maxwell with an intensity that made him feel strangely exposed. Finally she spoke. "Why?" It was a simple question but one loaded with meaning. Why was he, a billionaire CEO, interested in a small neighborhood grocery store? Why was he offering help to a complete stranger? Why did he care? "Because," Maxwell began, but for the first time in years the words didn't come easily. How could he explain something he didn't fully understand himself? "Because sometimes the universe puts us exactly where we need to be, even if we don't realize it." Emily, who had been unusually quiet throughout the conversation, suddenly asked, "Will we be able to have real ice cream? The freezer's been broken for a long time." The innocent question broke the tension in the room. Grace let out a soft laugh, and Maxwell realized it was the most genuine sound he'd heard in years. "It's not that simple, sweetheart," Grace said, brushing her hand gently through her daughter's hair. "Mr. Rothschild is a very busy man, and I'm sure he has more important things to do than worry about our little store." "Actually," Maxwell said, glancing at his phone, "my schedule just cleared up entirely. The Japanese investors have likely canceled the meeting, which means I have the whole day to discuss the details." He noticed the exact moment something shifted in Grace's expression, a small spark of hope battling against years of caution and disappointment. "Mr. Rothschild?" "Maxwell, please." "Maxwell," she corrected, "why would a man like you be interested in a store like this? Be honest with me." He considered her question for a moment, aware that his answer could shape the direction of everything that followed. "Because for years I built an empire based on numbers, Grace. I turned a family-owned company into a global corporation, but in the process, I lost something essential. What you have here, this connection to the community, this real sense of purpose, is something no amount of money can buy." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a business opportunity that would benefit everyone involved. Your store has real potential and you clearly have the talent to manage it. All that's missing are the proper resources." Grace looked around her small store, her gaze lingering on the worn corners, the half-empty shelves, the cramped space she and Emily called home. When her eyes returned to meet Maxwell's, there was a renewed determination in them. "If," she began, emphasizing the word, "I were to consider your proposal, I'd need guarantees. In writing. Emily is my priority, and I can't risk our only means of support on empty promises." Maxwell smiled, recognizing in her the same sharpness he himself used in negotiations. "Naturally. We can draft a contract detailing all the terms. You will maintain full control over the day-to-day operation, and Goldcrest will provide the necessary financial and logistical support." "And what do you want in return?" "A minority stake in future profits and the opportunity to use this project as a model for other similar partnerships. If we can turn your store into a success story, we could replicate the model in other neighborhoods, creating a network of neighborhood markets that retain their local identity while benefiting from the structure of a large company." Emily, who had been absorbed in drawing in her school notebook, suddenly looked up. "Can we have a section for books too? Like a small library?" Maxwell and Grace exchanged a surprised glance, and for a moment, something passed between them, a mutual understanding that this decision was bigger than just business. "You know what, Emily?" Maxwell replied, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I think a book section would be a great idea. Every great story needs a good beginning." And there, in the back of a small neighborhood grocery store, with the smell of coffee in the air and the dreams of a child echoing off the worn walls, something new began to take shape. An unlikely partnership that would defy all expectations and prove that sometimes the best investments are those that can't be measured on a spreadsheet. The days that followed the unlikely partnership between Maxwell Rothschild and Grace Johnson were a whirlwind of activity. The small grocery store, which had for years been on the brink of obsolescence, was now buzzing with architects, contractors, and consultants. However, not everything was smooth in the freshly planted garden of this unusual collaboration. "Absolutely not," Grace declared, her voice firm as she held the renovation plans in her hands. I'm not going to turn this grocery store into a generic convenience store with fluorescent lights and stainless steel shelves. This place has soul, Maxwell. It was a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the fateful meeting that had changed their lives. Emily was at school, a new private school that Maxwell had insisted she enroll in as part of the deal, and Grace was facing her first major clash with her new partner. Maxwell, immaculate in his navy blue suit, furrowed his brow. Grace, I understand your attachment to the traditional look, but modernization is essential for what? She interrupted, something rare in her usually restrained personality. To look like all the other convenience stores with no character? People have been coming here for years not just to buy, but because they feel at home. Because they know every corner, every product, every story. The silence that followed was tense. Maxwell watched Grace with renewed attention. There was something in her gaze, a mix of determination and fear, that suggested this argument was about more than just aesthetic preferences. There's something you're not telling me, he finally said, not a question but a statement. Grace hesitated, her hands unconsciously gripping the apron she still wore, even with all the changes underway. Finally, after a long moment, she sighed. This store, it's not just a business to me, Maxwell. It was my father's. Her voice trembled slightly. He built it from the ground up, working 16 hours a day, knowing every customer by name. When he died 5 years ago, it felt like a part of the neighborhood died with him. Maxwell felt something tighten in his chest. You never mentioned your father before. Because it hurts. Grace moved to the counter, running her hand over the worn wood. He died trying to save this place. The economy was in crisis, big chains were suffocating the small business owners, and he got into debt trying to keep the doors open. She paused, taking a deep breath. The night he had the heart attack, he was up late doing the books, trying to figure out how to pay the suppliers. Emily was only 1 year old. My husband had left us months earlier, and suddenly, I found myself alone with a baby and a store on the brink of bankruptcy. Maxwell remained silent, absorbing every word. Suddenly, Grace's resistance to modernization took on a new dimension. I kept the doors open these past few years through a lot of sacrifice, she continued. Sleeping in the back of the store wasn't a choice, it was the only option after I had to sell the house to pay off the debts my father left. But I never regretted it. Every board on this floor, every shelf, every product on the shelves tells a story. His story. Our story. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the revelations. Maxwell walked slowly through the space, his Italian shoes echoing on the wooden floor. For the first time he truly looked at the store, not as an executive assessing an investment, but as someone trying to see the memories imprinted in every corner. My father had a store too, he said suddenly, his voice softer than usual. Not a grocery store but a small hardware shop. When he died, I had just graduated with a degree in business. I was full of modern ideas and ambition. I sold the store, used the money to invest in the stock market, and, well, the rest is history. He turned to Grace, something vulnerable in his gaze. You know what the difference between us is, Grace? You fought to preserve your father's legacy. I destroyed mine in the name of progress. The moment of mutual understanding that passed between them was almost tangible. Grace moved closer, lightly touching Maxwell's arm. It's not too late to do things differently, she said softly. Before Maxwell could respond, the front door slammed open. A tall man with a stubble and bloodshot eyes staggered into the store. Grace? His voice was rough, still carrying the smell of alcohol even at that hour of the morning. So the rumors are true? You sold old Tom's store to a corporate shark. Grace visibly paled. Frank, you shouldn't be here. The restraining order. Restraining order? He laughed bitterly, stepping further into the store. You think a piece of paper is going to stop me from seeing my daughter? From protecting what's mine by right? Maxwell instinctively moved to stand between Grace and the newcomer. Sir, I suggest you leave. Frank completely ignored him, his eyes locked on Grace. 5 years, Grace. 5 years trying to make you see reason, trying to get my share of this place. And now you just hand everything over to some stranger in an expensive suit? The store was never yours, Frank, Grace replied, her voice trembling but firm. You abandoned me and Emily when we needed you most. You have no right here. No right? Frank took another step forward, his voice rising dangerously. I'm her father. And you're living like a beggar in the back of a falling apart store, while this executive is probably planning to turn it into another soulless convenience store. Enough. Maxwell's voice sliced through the air like a whip. Security. 2 burly men, part of the security team Maxwell had discreetly hired to oversee the construction. quickly appeared from the back area. "Escort him out," Maxwell ordered. "And make sure he understands that his presence here is unwelcome." As Frank was escorted out of the store, protesting and threatening to sue, Maxwell turned to Grace. She was visibly trembling, years of suppressed fear and tension coming to the surface. "Why didn't you tell me about him?" "Because I was afraid," she admitted, sinking into a nearby chair. "Afraid that if you knew all the complications, all the drama, you'd give up on the project. And I really need this to work, Maxwell. Not for me but for Emily." Maxwell studied the woman before him, so strong yet so vulnerable, and made a decision that would change not only the course of his business but his life. "Grace, I'm going to make you a promise right now," he said, kneeling to be at eye level with her. "We're not just going to preserve the essence of this store, we're going to honor your father's memory and create something Emily can be proud of. Something that's both progress and tradition." He took the renovation plans and tore them up demonstratively. "We'll start from scratch. You teach me about the soul of this place and I'll show you how we can strengthen it without destroying it. And as for your ex-husband," his eyes briefly hardened, "leave him to me. I have a whole team of lawyers who would love to take on something truly meaningful for a change." The tears Grace had been holding back finally overflowed, but there was a smile on her lips. "You know Maxwell Rothschild? I think my father would have liked you." "Really?" He smiled back, feeling something warm and inexplicable grow in his chest. "And why's that?" "Because behind all this facade of a ruthless businessman, you have something he always said was the most important thing in any venture: heart." In that moment, as the morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of the old grocery store, illuminating the particles of dust dancing in the air, something subtly shifted between them. A deeper understanding, a bond forged not just by business interests, but by shared wounds and reborn dreams. What neither of them yet realized was that this morning would mark more than just a change in the renovation plans. It was the beginning of a transformation that would go far beyond shelves and inventory systems. A transformation that began in the hearts of those who, by a twist of fate, had been brought together in that small corner of the world. The transformation of the grocery store moved forward at a steady pace, but in a way very different from what Maxwell had initially planned. Instead of large, noisy teams of builders, small groups of local craftsmen worked meticulously, restoring rather than replacing, preserving history while adding subtle modern touches. The old wooden counter, which Grace had so cherished, was carefully restored by a neighborhood carpenter, its stains and scratches treated as marks of character rather than imperfections. The original shelves were reinforced and refinished, retaining their rustic charm while gaining greater functionality. "Your father would have approved of this," Maxwell commented one afternoon, watching Grace rearrange products on the newly restored shelves. He had become a constant presence in the store, abandoning his expensive suits for more casual shirts when he visited, something his executives at Goldcrest found shocking. "It's funny," Grace replied, adjusting a can of peaches, "the more time you spend here, the more I start seeing little gestures that remind me of him." Maxwell raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" "The way you care about the details, how you treat the workers." She smiled, recalling something. "Yesterday, I saw you helping Mrs. Martinez with her groceries to the car. My father used to do exactly the same thing." The comment caught him off guard. It was true, he had found himself doing things he never would have imagined a few weeks ago. The Maxwell Rothschild of a month ago would have delegated the renovation oversight to a project manager and headed back to his office in the penthouse. Instead, here he was, spending his afternoons in a neighborhood grocery store, learning the names of regular customers and discovering a different kind of satisfaction. "Emily showed me her designs for the children's section," he commented, changing the subject. "She has an impressive imagination." Grace's face lit up at the mention of her daughter. "She's so excited about all of this. Did you know she started reading stories to the other kids after school? She turned that little corner you suggested into some sort of informal book club." Maxwell smiled, remembering how the idea had come about. Emily had mentioned that many of the neighborhood kids didn't have books at home, so he had suggested creating a cozy space in the store where they could read and do their homework. What had started as a simple corner with some cushions and a bookshelf was becoming a true community gathering spot. The sound of the doorbell interrupted his thoughts. A man in a suit entered the store, looking out of place among the old shelves. "Mr. Rothschild?" The man approached, holding a briefcase. "I'm James Parker from Goldcrest's legal department. We tried to reach you at the office, but your secretary said we'd find you here." Maxwell noticed the immediate tension in Grace's shoulders. Since the incident with Frank, she had become wary of unexpected visitors. "What's the matter, James?" Well, sir, it's about the neighborhood market expansion project. The board is concerned. Parker gave a meaningful glance at Grace before continuing. They would like an urgent meeting to discuss the direction this investment is taking. Maxwell felt a familiar irritation rising in his chest. And exactly what is the board's concern? Parker cleared his throat, uncomfortable. The numbers, sir. The investment per square foot in this unit is well above what was planned, and the proposed business model? Well, it doesn't align with the shareholders' return expectations. I see. Maxwell's voice took on a cold tone that Grace had never heard before. And I assume you have a suggestion? Yes, sir. The recommendation is to standardize the project, cut costs on these handmade restorations, and speed up the timeline to open more units by the end of this year. Grace felt her heart tighten. This was exactly what she had feared from the start, that in the end the numbers would speak louder than the people. James, Maxwell said, his voice dangerously calm, tell the board I'll be expecting them for a meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Not at the office. He paused significantly. Here? Parker looked horrified. But sir, the board never? Exactly. It's time for them to see what we're really building here. Maxwell smiled, but it wasn't his usual corporate smile. And James? Tell them to come prepared for breakfast. Grace makes the best homemade bread in town. After Parker left, clearly disturbed, Grace turned to Maxwell. You don't have to do this. I know you're risking a lot with this project. Grace, he said, his voice softening, when I started in this business, my father told me something I didn't understand for years. He said that a man can have all the money in the world, but if he loses his soul in the process, he dies poor. He walked to the window watching the street bustle. Children returning from school, elderly people chatting on the sidewalks, real life unfolding in its deepest simplicity. You know what I've realized in the past few weeks? I spent so much time building an empire that I forgot why I started. It wasn't about spreadsheets or quarterly reports. It was about creating something meaningful, something that made a difference in people's lives. Grace approached, lightly touching his arm. And this? What we're doing here? Is it meaningful? Maxwell turned to face her, and for a moment, Grace saw something in his eyes that made her catch her breath. A vulnerability, a truth neither of them was ready to name. More than you think, he replied softly. This place, Emily, they reminded me of something I had forgotten. That sometimes the best investments are the ones that can't be measured in dollars and cents. The doorbell rang again and Emily rushed in, her backpack swinging on her back. Mom. Mr. Maxwell. You won't believe what happened at school today. She stopped abruptly, noticing the charged atmosphere between the adults. Is everything okay? Maxwell crouched down to her level, smiling warmly. It's all good, little one. Actually, I need your help with a very important mission tomorrow. How about being our special hostess for a breakfast with some very important people? Emily's eyes lit up. Can I wear my new dress? The one Mrs. Martinez helped Mom pick out? Of course you can, Grace replied, exchanging a knowing glance with Maxwell. And I think we'll also need to bake that special chocolate cake your grandpa loved so much. As Emily rushed to the back of the store, already planning aloud the big event for the next day, Maxwell and Grace stood side by side, a comfortable silence between them. They both knew that the battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but they also knew that some things were worth fighting for. They won't understand, Grace said finally. You're bored. To them, it will just be another number on a spreadsheet. Then we'll make them understand, Maxwell replied with determination. Because this? He gestured to the store around them, to the people passing by on the street, to the life pulsing in every corner. This is the future. Not just of business, but of how we choose to live our lives. The afternoon sun streamed through the newly cleaned windows, casting golden patterns on the restored wood floor. The aroma of fresh coffee and baking bread filled the air, mixing with the scent of fresh wood and paint. It was the scent of transformation, of renewal, of hope. And as they watched Emily organizing her books in the little reading nook, Maxwell and Grace shared a moment of silent understanding. Some battles aren't fought with contracts and numbers, but with courage and conviction. And sometimes, the greatest act of rebellion against a world obsessed with profits is choosing to see the value in what cannot be priced. Morning arrived with a mixture of tension and determination in the air. Grace had woken before the sun to prepare a breakfast spread that would turn the small grocery store into something out of a movie. Freshly baked artisan breads, homemade cakes, fresh fruits artistically arranged, and the unmistakable aroma of premium coffee, courtesy of Maxwell, filling the entire space. Emily, radiant in her new dress, was arranging wildflowers that Mrs. Martinez had brought from her garden into small rustic vases scattered around the store. The girl had insisted on making handmade place cards for each board member, decorating them with small, colorful drawings. At 8:45, Maxwell arrived, impeccable in his most expensive suit, but with an expression Grace had never seen before, a mix of steel and vulnerability that made her heart tighten. "Is everything ready?" he asked, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture that seemed strangely out of character for the powerful CEO. "Almost," Grace replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Emily is finishing up the place cards." Maxwell moved closer to her, lowering his voice. "Grace, I need you to know something before they arrive. If things don't go well today—" "No," she interrupted softly. "Let's not think like that. You taught me that sometimes we need to have faith in the impossible." The sound of cars parking outside interrupted the moment. Through the newly restored windows, they could see a row of luxury vehicles stopping in front of the store. The contrast between the imported cars and the simple neighborhood setting couldn't have been more striking. The board members entered in a line, their critical gazes evaluating every detail of the surroundings. There were 12 in total, each representing decades of corporate experience and billions in investments. "Good morning." Emily was the first to speak, her clear and confident voice breaking the tense silence. "Welcome to our store. I made special place cards for each of you." The surprise on the executives' faces was almost comical. A particularly austere lady, whom Grace recognized from business magazines as Victoria Blackwood, the major shareholder of Goldcrest, seemed unsure how to respond to the little hostess. "Right this way, please." Maxwell took charge, guiding the group to the area set up for the meeting. "I thought it would be important to start our day with a little perspective." The meeting officially began once everyone was seated. James Parker, the lawyer from the previous day, started by presenting numbers and charts on his tablet. "As you can see," he explained, "the investment in this particular unit is 300% above the budget set for our standard expansion model. The insistence on using local artisans and premium materials, because each piece tells a story," Emily innocently interrupted, pouring more coffee for Victoria Blackwood. "Like this table. Mr. Rodriguez took 3 days to restore it because it was my grandfather's favorite table." A disconcerting silence fell over the group. Victoria studied the girl for a long moment before turning to Maxwell. "Mr. Rothschild," her voice sharp as a razor, "I understand your enthusiasm for this project. But we are a corporation, not a charity. Our shareholders expect consistent returns." It was at this moment that something unexpected happened. The shop door opened and an elderly woman entered, supported by her cane. It was Mrs. Rosa, a client for over 40 years. "Grace dear," she called, her voice trembling slightly, "did you bring that medicine for Arthur?" Grace immediately moved to assist her, but Maxwell stopped her with a gentle gesture. "Allow me," he said, rising and walking toward the woman. The board watched in stunned silence as the CEO of Goldcrest Enterprises helped the elderly woman, sorted her medications, and even wrote down the correct times for each dose in a small notebook. "You know, young man," Mrs. Rosa said, holding Maxwell's hand, "you remind me so much of Tom. He always cared too." When Maxwell returned to the table, Victoria Blackwood was watching him with an indescribable expression. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice firm, "I came prepared today with spreadsheets and projections to justify every penny invested here. But I think we've all just witnessed something that no number can quantify." He paused, looking each board member in the eye. "Goldcrest started as a family business. My grandfather opened our first store not much different from this one. Somewhere along the way as we grew we forgot something fundamental. Business isn't just about profit margins. It's about people." "That's very poetic, Maxwell," Victoria interrupted, "but poetry doesn't pay dividends." It was then that Grace stepped forward, her voice surprisingly firm. "With all due respect, Ms. Blackwood, maybe it's time we redefine what we consider profit." She grabbed a thick ledger from behind the counter. "This is the store journal my father kept for 30 years. These aren't just numbers, they're stories. The first installment purchase the Silva family made when they moved to the neighborhood with nothing. The medicines we gave to Mrs. Rosa when her insurance didn't cover her treatment. The food baskets we put together during the pandemic. And now," Maxwell continued, "in just 1 month since we began the renovation, our revenue has increased by 60%. Not because we've changed who we are, but because we've improved what we already did well." Victoria abruptly stood up, and for a terrible moment, Grace thought she was about to leave. Instead, the executive slowly walked through the store, observing the details, the customers coming and going, the the reading corner where some children were already settling in to do their homework. Finally, she stopped in front of an old photograph on the wall. Tom Johnson, Grace's father, on the day the store opened. "My father also had a store," she said softly, catching everyone off guard. "We sold it to a large chain when he passed away. 6 months later it shut down. No one cared about the customers the way he did." She turned to face the board. Maybe we're facing an opportunity to do something different. Something meaningful." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Emily, who began handing out slices of chocolate cake to everyone. "You know what my grandfather always used to say?" the girl remarked, placing a particularly large piece in front of Victoria. "That the true value of something isn't in the price, but in the heart you put into it." Victoria Blackwood, the feared queen of financial markets, looked at the slice of cake in front of her, then at Emily, and did something no one at the board had ever seen her do. She smiled. "Mr. Rothschild," she finally said, "I think we need to reassess our expansion strategy. Clearly we have much to learn from this pilot project." The relief that flooded the room was palpable. Maxwell caught Grace's gaze, finding in it a mix of gratitude and something more, something unsaid but increasingly hard to ignore. But the morning still held one last surprise. As the board members began to disperse, discussing new business models and expansion possibilities, the shop door opened once more. Frank was back. But this time he wasn't alone. A man in a suit stood beside him, carrying a briefcase full of documents. "Grace," he called, his voice strangely controlled, "I think we need to have one final conversation about Emily's custody." The world seemed to freeze in that moment. All the progress, all the hope of the morning, threatened by a ghost from the past that refused to fade away. And so, in what should have been a moment of triumph, Grace and Maxwell found themselves facing their greatest battle yet. A battle that would test not only their business partnership but the true limits of their commitment to each other and the family they had unknowingly started to build. The office at the back of the grocery store, newly renovated but still retaining its original charm, had transformed into an arena of silent battle. Grace sat rigidly in her chair, her hands tightly clenched together, her knuckles white from the force. On the other side of the table, Frank and his lawyer wore smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Maxwell stood by the window, his presence a silent fortress that Grace hadn't known she needed until that moment. Victoria Blackwood, surprisingly, had chosen to stay, dismissing the rest of the board with a commanding gesture that left no room for questioning. "The documents are quite clear," Frank's lawyer explained, his monotonous voice echoing in the small room. "My client has paternal rights that were never formally waived. Considering the current living conditions and the apparent instability of the business environment." "Instability?" Victoria interrupted, her voice cutting like ice. "Forgive me, but are you referring to a partnership with Goldcrest Enterprises?" "A partnership that is dramatically altering the child's family environment," the lawyer countered. "Routine changes, exposure to strangers during renovations, not to mention living at the workplace." "Enough." Grace's voice trembled, but there was steel in her words. "You abandoned your daughter, Frank. Left a 1-year-old baby and never looked back. Not a visit, not a phone call, not a cent of child support in 5 years." "I was sick." Frank exploded, his face red. "You know I was struggling with alcoholism. Now I'm better. I've been sober for 6 months and coincidentally decided to fight for custody exactly when the store started thriving," Maxwell remarked gently, speaking for the first time. "Interesting timing." Frank's lawyer cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "My client's motivations are not on trial here. The fact remains that he is the biological father and has rights." "Rights?" Emily's voice came from the door, causing everyone to turn. No one had seen her come in. She was still wearing the beautiful dress from the board meeting, but her eyes were full of unshed tears. "What rights? You don't even know what my favorite subject at school is. You don't know I'm allergic to strawberries. You weren't there when I lost my first tooth or when I won the reading contest or when Grandpa died." "Emily, sweetheart," Frank stood up, extending his hand. "No?" The girl recoiled. "You're not my father. A father is someone who's there. Like Mr. Maxwell, who helps me with my math homework and built our bookshelves and makes mommy smile again." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace felt her heart stop for a moment as Maxwell seemed struck by a bolt of lightning. Victoria Blackwood chose this moment to speak, rising with the elegance of a queen about to decree a sentence. "Sir," she consulted a business card on the table, "Patterson. I'm Victoria Blackwood, the largest shareholder of Goldcrest Enterprises and, by coincidence, a former family court prosecutor before I entered the corporate world." Allow me to clarify a few points. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a series of documents. First, I have here detailed records of all the failed attempts to contact for child support payments over the last 5 years. Second, police reports from 3 incidents involving your client in a state of intoxication near this property, violating a restraining order. And third, she smiled, a smile that would make sharks retreat, a complete financial analysis of your client's current situation, including significant gambling debts at several establishments of questionable repute. Frank visibly paled. His lawyer began to sweat. Now, Victoria continued, we can turn this into a long and expensive legal battle that your client clearly can't afford, or we can resolve this civilly. Your choice. Frank's lawyer leaned in to whisper something in his ear. After a tense moment, Frank abruptly stood up. This isn't over, he muttered, but his voice had lost all the confidence it once held. Yes, it is. Maxwell finally moved away from the window, his voice calm but heavy with authority. You're leaving now, Frank. And you're not coming back. Because if you do, he paused significantly. I'll personally make sure every cent you owe is collected immediately. After Frank and his lawyer left, Emily ran into her mother's arms. Grace hugged her tightly, silent tears streaming down her face. Victoria discreetly gathered her things. I think my work here is done. Maxwell, I'll expect the quarterly report on Monday. Grace, the cake was divine. Emily, she smiled genuinely, you're so much like your mother, darling. When the door closed behind Victoria, leaving only the 3 of them in the office, the silence that followed was filled with unspoken emotions. Mr. Maxwell, Emily began timidly, I'm sorry for what I said, about you being like a father. Maxwell knelt down to her level, his eyes shining with something suspiciously like emotion. Emily, that was the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said about me. Grace watched the scene, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. Maxwell, I don't know how to thank you. No. He gently interrupted her, rising and stepping closer. I'm the one who needs to thank you. Both of you, you've given me something I didn't know I was looking for. A purpose. A family. He hesitated for a moment, then continued, his voice rough with emotion. Grace, when my car broke down that morning, I thought it was the worst day of my life. But now I know it was the best. Because it brought me to you. To both of you. Grace felt her heart race. Maxwell? Let me finish, please. He took another step toward her. I've spent my whole life building walls around me, hiding behind numbers and contracts. Then you and Emily came along and without even realizing it, you tore each one down. And for the first time in years, I can breathe. I can feel. I can love. Emily suggested innocently, making both adults laugh through their tears. Yes, little one, Maxwell replied, never taking his eyes off Grace. Love. The moment that followed was like magic. Grace stepped forward. Maxwell closed the remaining distance, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted like fresh coffee, tears of relief, and promises of a future neither of them had dared to dream of until then. Emily clapped her hands, jumping for joy. Finally. Mrs. Martinez is going to be so happy. She said you two were slower than her bread rising. The laughter that erupted between them was liberating. The laughter of people who had finally found their place in the world, who realized that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the most unlikely places, and that love, when true, has the power to transform not just hearts but entire lives. Outside, the afternoon sun bathed the renovated grocery store in a golden light. As customers came and went, children settled into the reading nook, and life followed its course, richer and fuller than ever. A year had passed since that transformative afternoon in the small office at the back of the grocery store. The most visible change wasn't just in the store's renovated facade, now a harmonious balance of tradition and modernity, but in the spirit that permeated the entire neighborhood. The Johnson and Rothschild grocery had become more than just a store. It was the beating heart of the community. The back room, where Grace and Emily used to live, had been transformed into a cozy community library, with comfortable armchairs and shelves filled with books. Emily, now 7 years old, proudly presided over the children's book club that met there every afternoon after school. Grace watched the activity in the store from her new position behind the restored counter, her engagement ring subtly shining on her left hand. Maxwell had proposed to her on a regular Sunday while they were organizing stock together. Because, as he put it, it was through doing simple things by her side that he discovered the true meaning of happiness. What are you thinking about? Maxwell's voice brought her back to the present. He had just arrived, bringing with him the familiar scent of premium coffee and the calm energy that now defined him. How much everything has changed, she replied, smiling as he leaned in for a quick kiss. Dad used to say that a store is like a living being, it grows and transforms with the people who are part of it. Maxwell nodded, his eyes scanning the space with evident satisfaction. The grocery store had become the pilot project for a new division of Goldcrest, Commerce with Purpose. Under the watchful eye of Victoria Blackwood, who had become an unlikely ally and an even more unexpected friend, the model was being carefully replicated in other neighborhoods, not as a generic formula, but respecting the identity and needs of each community. "Did you know Mrs. Rosa organized a knitting group that meets here every Wednesday?" Grace commented, tidying up a nearby shelf. "They make sweaters and blankets for the local senior shelter. And Mr. Rodriguez is teaching woodworking to the youth in the community space we opened in the back," Maxwell added proudly. "3 of them have already gotten jobs because of the classes." The doorbell jingled and Emily ran in, her backpack bouncing on her back. "Dad, Mom, guess what? The teacher loved my essay on transformation." The dad had slipped naturally from Emily's lips a few months after that pivotal afternoon, and every time Maxwell heard it, his heart warmed. He picked up the girl, despite her protesting that she was too big for this. "Really? And what exactly did you write about, little one?" "About our store. About how sometimes the most important things in life happen when we least expect them, like when your car broke down here. And how love can transform not only people but entire places." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched the two of them, her family, a gift that fate had given her when she least expected it. Mrs. Martinez, passing through for her daily visit, smiled as she saw the scene. "You know, Grace," she whispered, "your father would be so proud. Not just of the store but of seeing you this happy." And she was right. The small grocery store that Tom Johnson had built with so much love had not only survived, it had thrived, turning into something bigger than he could have ever imagined, while still maintaining its most important essence: the power to unite people and create bonds that transcended simple commercial transactions. Maxwell put Emily down, watching her run to organize her favorite books in the community library. He approached Grace, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Sometimes I wonder," he reflected, "who saved who that morning?" Grace turned in his arms, smiling. "I think we saved each other. You gave us a second chance and we gave you a new purpose." "More than that," Maxwell replied, his gaze sweeping over the busy store, people talking, laughing, living. "You taught me that true success isn't measured in dollars but in smiles. In lives touched. In hearts transformed." The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting golden patterns on the restored wooden floor. The scent of fresh bread mixed with coffee and the laughter of children. It was the smell of home, of community, of love. It was the smell of transformation. Dear viewers, what did you think of this story of love, overcoming obstacles, and transformation? If this narrative touched your heart as much as it touched ours in telling it, don't forget to leave your comments below. We'd love to hear what your favorite part was and what other inspiring stories like this you'd like to hear. If you were moved by Maxwell, Grace, and Emily's journey, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Life Stories channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you inspiring stories that remind us of the transformative power of love and the importance of keeping our hearts open to the unexpected encounters life has in store for us. Until the next story.